comings and goings, of course, not even the Ajas. Custom ruled everyone, and custom strongly discouraged direct questions about what a sister was doing or where she was going. Most likely, Fredrine and Shamari had been to hear from some of their eyes and ears face to face, or maybe to look at a book in some library. They were brown, but she could not help thinking of Nisau's comment about sisters slipping away to Elida. It was quite possible to hire a boatman to make the crossing to the city, where dozens of tiny water gates gave entrance to anyone who wished it. But with a gateway, there was no need to risk exposure by riding to the river and asking after boats. Just one sister returning to the tower with the knowledge of that weave would give away their largest advantage, and there was no way to stop it, except to keep heart in the opposition to Elida, except to make the sisters believe there could be a quick end to this. If only there was a way to a quick end. Not far beyond the traveling ground, Egwene drew rein and frowned at a long wall tent, even more patched than the hall. An Aes Sedai came swanning down the walkway. She wore a plain dark blue cloak, and the cowl hid her face, but novices and others skipped out of her way, as they never would have for a merchant, say, and paused in front of the tent, looking at it for a long moment before pushing aside the entry flap to go inside, her unwillingness as clear as if she had shouted. Egwene had never gone in there. She could feel Saidar being channeled inside, though faintly. The amount necessary was surprisingly small. A quick visit from the Amerlin should not draw too much attention, however. She very much wanted to see what she had set in motion. Dismounting in front of the tent, though, she discovered a trifling difficulty. There was nowhere to tie Daishar. The Amerlin always had someone rushing to hold her stirrup and take away her horse, but she stood there holding the gelding's reins, and clusters of novices bustled past with no more than a quick glance, dismissing her as one of the visitors. By this time every novice knew all of the accepted on sight, but few had seen the Amerlin's seat close up. She did not even have the ageless face to tell them she was Aes Sedai. With a rueful laugh, she put a gloved hand into her belt pouch. The stole would tell them who she was, and then she could order one of them to hold her horse for a few minutes, unless they thought it was a joke in bad taste, at least. Some of the novices from Emmons Field had tried to pull the stole from her neck to keep her from getting in trouble. No, that was past and dealt with. Abruptly, the entry flap was pushed open, and Lyanna emerged, fastening her dark green cloak with a silver pin in the shape of a fish. The cloak was silk, and richly embroidered in silver and gold, as was the bodice of her riding dress. Her red gloves were embroidered on the backs, too. Lyanna paid minute attention to her clothes since joining the Green Aja. Her eyes widened lightly at the sight of Egwene, but her coppery face smoothed immediately. Taking in the situation at a glance, she put out a hand to stop a novice who appeared to be by herself. Novices went to classes by family. "What's your name, child?" Much had changed about Lyanna, but not her briskness, except when she wanted it to, anyway. Most men turned to putty when Lyanna's voice grew languorous, but she never wasted that on women. "Are you on an errand for a sister?" The novice, a pale-eyed woman close to her middle years, with an unblemished skin that had never seen a day's work in the field, gaped openly before recovering enough to make her curtsy, a smoothly practiced spreading of her white skirts with mittened hands. As tall as most men, but willowy and graceful and beautiful, Lyanna lacked the ageless look, too, yet hers was one of the two most well-known faces in the camp. Novices pointed her out in awe. A sister who had once been keeper, who had been stilled and healed so she could channel again, if not so strongly as before. And then she had changed Ajas. The newest women in white already had learned that that just never happened, though the other was becoming a part of lore, unfortunately. It was harder to make a novice go slowly when you could not point out that she risked ending her quest for the shawl by burning herself out and losing the one power forever. "Lettuce Muro Aes Sedai," the woman said respectfully in a lilting Murandian accent. She sounded as if she wanted to say more, perhaps to give a title, but one of the first lessons on joining the tower was that you had left behind who you used to be. It was a hard lesson for some, especially those who possessed titles. I'm going to visit my sister. I haven't seen her more than a minute since before we left Murundi. Relatives were always put in different novice families, as were women who had known each other before being entered in the novice book. It encouraged making new friends, and cut down on the inevitable tensions when one was learning faster than the other, or had a higher potential. She's free of classes too until the afternoon, and your sister will have to wait a while longer, child, Liana broke in. Hold the Armerlin's horse for her. Lettuce gave a start and stared at Egwene, who had finally managed to extract her stole. Handing Daishar's reins to the woman, she lowered her cowl and settled the long, narrow strip of cloth onto her shoulders. Light as a feather in her pouch, the stole had real weight hanging around her neck. Swan claimed that sometimes you could feel every woman who had ever worn the stole hanging from the ends of it, a constant reminder of responsibility and duty, and Egwene believed every word. The Murandian gaped at her harder than she had for Liana, and took longer to remember to curtsy. No doubt she had heard that the Amelin was young, but it seemed unlikely she had given a thought to how young. Thank you, child, Egwene said smoothly. There had been a time when she felt strange calling a woman 10 years older than herself child. Everything changed with time. It won't be for long. Liana, would you ask someone to send a groom for Daisha? Now that I'm out of the saddle, I'd as soon stay out, and Lettuce should be allowed to see her sister. I will see to it myself, mother. Liana offered a fluid curtsy and moved away with never a hint that there was more between them than this chance encounter. Egwene trusted her far more than she did Anaya or even Shirian. She certainly kept no secrets from Liana, any more than from Swan. But their friendship was yet another secret that had to be kept. For one thing, Liana had eyes and ears actually inside Tar Valon, if not in the tower itself, and their reports came to Egwene and Egwene alone. For another, Liana was much petted for accommodating so well to her reduced status, and every sister welcomed her, if only because she was living proof that stilling, the deepest dread of any Aes Sedai, could be reversed. They welcomed her with open arms, and because she was less now, standing below at least half the sisters in the camp, they often spoke in front of her about matters they would never want the Amerlin to know of. So Egwene did not so much as glance after her as she left. Instead, she offered Lettuce a smile. The woman reddened and bobbed another curtsy, then entered the tent, stripping off her gloves and tucking them behind her belt. Inside, 8 mirrored stand lamps stood along the walls between low wooden chests. One with a bit of worn gilding and the rest of painted iron. No 2 of the lamps had the same number of arms, but they provided good illumination, if not so bright as outside. Assorted tables that seemed to have come from 7 different farm kitchens made a row down the center of the canvas ground cloth. The benches of the 3 farthest occupied by a half a dozen novices with their cloaks folded beside them, each woman surrounded by the glow of the power. Tiana, the novices, hovered anxiously, walking between the tables, and surprisingly, so did Sharina Malloy, one of the novices acquired in Murundi. Well, Sharina was not exactly hovering, just watching calmly, and perhaps it should not have been a surprise to find her there. A dignified, gray-haired grandmother with a tight bun on the back of her head, Sharina had run a very large family with a very firm hand, and she seemed to have adopted all of the other novices as granddaughters or grandnieces. She was the one who had organized them into those tiny families, completely on her own, and apparently out of simple disgust at seeing everyone flounder around. Most Aes Sedai went more than a touch tight-mouthed if reminded of that, though they had accepted the form easily enough once they realized how much easier it was keeping track and organizing classes. Tiana was inspecting the novices' work so closely that it seemed obvious she was attempting to ignore Sharina's presence. Short and slight, with large brown eyes and a dimple in her cheek, Tiana somehow looked young despite her ageless face, particularly alongside the taller novice with cheeks and broad hips. The pair of Aes Sedai channeling at the table nearest the entrance, Chiron and Ashmanila, had an audience of two as well. Janya Frenda, a sitter for the brown, and Salita Toranas, a sitter for the yellow. The Aes Sedai and the novices were all performing the same task. In front of each woman, a close net, woven of earth, fire, and air, surrounded a small bowl or cup or the like, all made by the camp's blacksmiths, who were very puzzled at why the sisters wanted such things made of iron, not to mention having them made as finely as if they were silver. A second weave, earth and fire, woven just so, penetrated each net to touch the object, which was slowly turning white. Very, very slowly. Ability with the weave improved with practice, but of the 5 powers, strength in earth was the key, and beside Egwene herself, only 9 sisters in the camp, along with 2 of the accepted and nearly 24 novices, had sufficient of that to make the weaves work at all. Few among the sisters wanted to give any time to it, though. Ashmanila, lean enough to make her seem taller than she really was, fingers tapping the tabletop on either side of the simple metal cup in front of her, was frowning impatiently as the edge of whiteness crept upward past halfway. Chiron's blue eyes were cold enough that it seemed her stare alone might shatter the tall goblet she was working on. That had only the smallest rim of white at the bottom. It must have been Chiron seen going in. Not everyone was unenthusiastic, though. Janya, slim in her pale bronze silks and wearing her brown-fringed shawl draped over her arms, studied what Chiron and Ashmanila were doing with the eagerness of one who wished she could be doing the same. Janya wanted to know everything, to know how everything was done and why it happened that way. She had been extremely disappointed when she could not learn to make terangreal. Only 3 sisters aside from Elaine had managed that so far, with very spotty success, and she had made a concerted effort to learn this skill, even after the testing showed she fell short of the required strength in using earth. Salita was the first to notice Egwene. Round-faced and almost as dark as charcoal, she eyed Egwene levelly, and the yellow fringe of her shawl swayed slightly as she made a very precise curtsy, exact to the inch. Raised in Salidar, Salita was part of a disturbing pattern. Too many sitters who were too young for the position. Salita had only been Aes Sedai for 35 years, and rarely was a woman given a chair before wearing the shawl for 100 or more. Swan saw a pattern anyway and thought it disturbing, though she could not say why. Patterns she could not understand always disturbed Swan. Still, Salita had stood for war against Elida and frequently supported Egwene in the hall, but not always, and not in this. "Mother," she said coolly. Janya's head jerked up and she broke into a beaming smile. She also had stood for war, the only woman who had been a sitter before the tower divided to do so, excepting Lilane and Lirella, 2 of the Blues. And if her support for Egwene was not always unwavering, it was so here. As usual, words spilled out of her. "I will never get over this, Mother. It's simply amazing. I know we shouldn't be surprised any longer when you come up with something no one else has thought of. Sometimes I think we've gotten too set in our ways, too sure what can and cannot be done. But to puzzle out how to make Gwendi Yar—" She paused for breath, and Salita moved into the gap smoothly and coldly. "I still say it is wrong," she said firmly. "I admit the discovery was a brilliant piece of work on your part, Mother, but Aes Sedai should not be making things for sale." Salita invested that word with all the scorn who accepted the income from her estate in Tyr without ever thinking how it had been come by. The attitude was not uncommon, though most sisters lived on the tower's generous yearly allowance, or had, before the tower split apart. On top of which, she went on, "Nearly half the sisters forced into this are yellow. I receive complaints every day. We, at least, have more important uses for our time than making trinkets." That earned her a hard glare from Ashmanila, a grey, and a frigid stare from Chiron, who was blue, but Salita ignored them. She was one of those yellows who seemed to think the other Rajas were only complements to her own, which, of course, had the only truly useful purpose among them. And novices should not be doing weaves of this complexity at all, Tiana added, joining them. The mistress of novices was never shy about speaking up to sitters or to the Amerlin, and she wore a disgruntled expression. She did not appear to realize that it deepened her dimple and made her look sulky. It is a remarkable discovery, and I for one have no objections to trade, but some of these girls can barely manage to make a ball of fire change color with any surety. Letting them handle weaves like this will only make it more difficult to stop them from leaping to things they can't handle, and the light knows that's difficult enough already. They may even do themselves an injury. Nonsense, nonsense, Janya exclaimed, waving a slender hand as if to brush away the very idea. Every girl who's been chosen can already make 3 balls of fire at once, and this requires very little more of the power. There's no danger at all so long as they're under a sister's supervision, and they always are. I've seen the roster. Besides, what we make in a day will bring enough to pay the army for a week or more, but the sisters alone can't produce near that much. Squinting slightly, she suddenly appeared to be looking through Tiana. The cascade from her tongue never slowed, yet she seemed to be talking at least half to herself. We will have to take great care in the selling. The sea folk have a voracious appetite for Quendiar, and there are plenty of their ships still at Ilion and Tyr by all accounts. The nobles there are green for it too, but even ravenous appetites have limits. I still cannot decide whether it will be best to appear with everything at once, or let it trickle out. Sooner or later even the price of Quendiar will begin to drop. Abruptly she blinked, and peered first at Tiana, then at Salita, tilting her head to one side. You do see my point, don't you? Salita glowered and hitched her shawl up on her shoulders. Tiana threw up her hands in exasperation. Egwene held her peace. For once she felt no shame at being praised for one of her supposed discoveries. Unlike nearly everything else except traveling, this one actually was hers, though Mogadine had pointed the way before she escaped. The woman did not know how to actually make anything. At least, she had not revealed any such knowledge, however hard Egwene had pressed her, and she had pressed very hard. But Mogadine had a wide streak of greed, and even in the age of legends, Quendiar had been a prized luxury. She had known enough of how it was made for Egwene to puzzle out the rest. In any case, no matter who objected or how strenuously, the need for money meant the production of Quendiar would continue, though as far as she was concerned, the longer before any of it was sold, the better. Sharina, clapping her hands together loudly in the back of the tent, jerked everyone's head that way. Chiron and Ashmanila turned too, the blue even letting her weaves go, so the goblet bounced on the tabletop with a metallic clatter. It was a sign of boredom. The process could be started over, though finding the precise point was very hard, and some sisters took every opportunity to do anything else during the hour they had to spend in the tent each day. An hour or until they completed one item start to finish, whichever came first. That was supposed to push them to try harder at increasing their skill, but few had progressed very far. Vote a win, Nicola. Off to your next class, Sharina announced. She did not speak loudly, but her voice had a strength that could have cut through a babel of voices, much less the quiet of the tent. You have just time to wash your hands and faces. Quickly now. You don't want any bad reports. Vodawin moved with efficient alacrity, releasing Saidar and placing her half-made Quendiar bracelet in one of the chests along the wall for someone else to finish, then gathering her cloak. Plump-cheeked and pretty, she wore her hair in a long, dark braid, though Egwene was not sure she had gotten permission from the women's circle. But then that world was behind her now. Tugging on her mittens as she hurried from the tent, Boda kept her eyes down and never glanced in Egwene's direction. Plainly, she still did not understand why a novice could not drop by to chat with the Amerlin seat whenever she wanted, even if they had grown up together. Egwene would have loved to talk with Boda and some of the others, but an Amerlin had lessons to learn too. And Amerlin had many duties, few friends, and no favorites. Besides, even the appearance of favoritism would mark the Two Rivers girls out and make their lives with the other novices a misery. And it wouldn't do me much good with the hall either, she thought wryly. She did wish the Two Rivers girls understood, though. The other novice Sharina had named did not leave her bench or stop channeling. Nicola's black eyes flashed at Sharina. I could be the best at this if I was ever allowed to really practice, she grumbled sullenly. I'm getting better, I know I am. I can foretell you. As if the one had anything to do with the other. Tiana said I tell her I can stay longer. I can finish this bowl before my next class, and I'm sure Adina said I won't mind if I'm just a little late. If her class was any time soon, she would be more than a little late if she tarried to complete the bowl. Her hour's effort had turned only half of it white. Tiana opened her mouth, but before she could utter a word, Sharina raised one finger, then a moment later, a second. It must have had some particular significance, because Nicola went pale and let go of her weaves on the instant, leaping up so quickly that she joggled the bench, earning quick frowns from the other two novices who shared it. They bent quickly back to their work, though, and Nicola almost ran to thrust the half-done bowl into a chest before snatching up her cloak. To Egwene's surprise, a woman she had not seen, dressed in a short brown coat and wide trousers, jumped up from where she had been sitting on the ground cloth beyond the tables. Scowling blue-eyed daggers at everyone in sight, Arena ran out of the tent after Nicola, the two women mirror images of disgruntlement and discontent. Seeing the pair of them together made Egwene uneasy. I didn't know friends were allowed in here to watch, she said. Is Nicola still causing problems? Nicola and Arena had attempted to blackmail her and Mirel and Misao, but that was not what she meant. That was still another secret. Better the girl's friendly with Arena than with one of the male grooms, Tiana said with a sniff. We've had 2 get with child, you know, and 10 more likely to. The girl needs more friends, though. Friends will do the trick with her. She cut off as 2 more white-clad novices hurried into the tent, the pair of them squeaking and skidding to a halt when they found Aes Sedai standing right in front of them. Hastily dropping curtsies, they scuttled to the back of the tent at a gesture from Tiana and folded their cloaks on a bench before fetching a partly white goblet and an almost white cup from one of the chests. Sharina saw them settled to work, then gathered her own cloak and swung it around her shoulders before coming up the tent. If you will excuse me, Tiana Sedai, she said, making a curtsy that just came short of being to an equal. I've been told off to help with the midday meal today, and I wouldn't want to get crosswise with the cooks. Her dark eyes rested on Egwene for a brief moment, and she nodded to herself. Go on then, Tiana said sharply. I would hate to hear you had been switched for being late. Without turning a hair, Sharina offered her courtesies again, neither in a hurry nor dragging it out, to Tiana, to the sitters, to Egwene, with another glance that was penetrating but too short for offense, and when the tent flap swung shut behind her, Tiana blew out her cheeks in exasperation. Nicola causes less trouble than some, she said darkly, and Janya shook her head. Sharina doesn't cause problems, Tiana. She spoke as quickly as ever, but quietly, so her voice would not carry to the back of the tent. Disagreements between sisters were never aired in front of novices, especially when the disagreement was over a novice. She already knows the rules better than any accepted, and never puts a toe over the line. She never shirks at even the dirtiest chores either, and she's the first to lend a hand when another novice needs one. Sharina is simply who she is. Light. You can't allow a novice to intimidate you. Tiana stiffened and opened her mouth angrily, but once Janya had the bit between her teeth, getting a word in edgewise was no easy matter. Nicola, on the other hand, causes all sorts of problems, Mother, the Brown rushed on. Ever since we found out she has the foretelling, she's been foretelling 2 or 3 times a day to hear her tell it, or rather to hear Arena tell it. Nicola is smart enough to know everyone is aware she can't remember what she says when she foretells, but Arena always seems to be there to hear and remember and help her interpret. Some are the sort of thing anyone in the camp with half a brain and a credulous nature might think of. Battles with the Shan-Chan or the Ashanan, an Amerlin imprisoned, the Dragon Reborn doing 9 impossible things. visions that might be Tarmangaiden or a bilious stomach, and the rest all just happened to indicate that Nicola ought to be allowed to go faster with her lessons. She's always too greedy for that. I think even most of the other novices have stopped believing her. She also pokes her nose everywhere, Salita put in the moment Janya gave her an opening. Her and the groom both. Her face remained smooth and cool, and she shifted her shawl as though that were the focus of her attention, but she rushed her words a little, perhaps fearing that the brown would take over again. They've both been switched for eavesdropping on sisters, and I myself caught Nicola trying to peek into one of the traveling grounds. She said she just wanted to see a gateway open, but I think she was trying to learn the weave. Impatience I can understand, but deceit cannot be tolerated. I no longer believe Nicola will attain the shawl, and frankly I've begun to wonder whether she should be sent away soon rather than late. The novice book may be open to everyone, she finished with an expressionless glance at Egwene, but we do not have to lower our standards completely. Glaring, Tiana pursed her lips stubbornly, emphasizing her dimple again. You could almost forget she had worn the shawl for over 30 years and think her a novice herself. As long as I am mistress of novices, the decision on whether to send a girl away is mine, she said heatedly, and I do not intend to lose a girl of Nicola's potential. Nicola would be very strong in the power one day. Or Sharina's, she added with a grimace, hands smoothing her skirts in irritation. Sharina's potential was nothing short of remarkable, far beyond anyone in living memory except for Nynaeve, and ahead of Nynaeve as well. Some thought she might become as strong as it was possible to be, though that was only speculation. If Nicola has been bothering you, Mother, I will see to her. I was just curious, Egwene said carefully, swallowing a suggestion that the young woman and her friend both be watched closely. She did not want to talk about Nicola. It would be too easy to find herself with a choice between lying or revealing matters she dared not expose. A pity she had not allowed Swan to arrange for 2 quiet deaths. Her head jerked in shock at the thought. Had she gone that far from Emmons Field? She knew she would have to order men to die in battle sooner or later, and she thought she might be able to order a death if the need was great enough. If one death could stop the death of thousands, or even hundreds, was it not right to order it? But the danger presented by Nicola and Arena was simply that they might reveal secrets that could inconvenience Egwene Alvir. Oh, Mirel and the others might be lucky to get off with a birching, and they would certainly consider that more than inconvenient. But discomfort, however great, was not sufficient reason for killing. Abruptly, Egwene realized that she was frowning, and Tiana and the 2 sitters were watching her, Janya not bothering to hide her curiosity behind a mask of serenity. To cover herself, Egwene shifted her frown to the table where Chiron and Ashmanila were once more at work. The white on Ashmanila's cup had climbed a little farther, but in just that short time Chiron had caught up. More than caught up, in fact, since her goblet stood twice as high as the cup. Your skill is improving, Chiron, Egwene said approvingly. The blue looked up at her and drew a deep breath. Her oval face became an image of cool calm around those icy blue eyes. There isn't much skill involved, Mother. All that's needed is to set the weave and wait. The last word held a touch of acridness, and for that matter there had been a slight hesitation before Mother. Chiron had been sent off from Saladar on a very important mission, only to see it collapse in a shambles, though from no fault of hers, and she had returned to them in Murundi to find everything she had left behind stood on its head, and a girl she remembered as a novice wearing the Amerlin's stole. Of late, Chiron had been spending a good deal of time with Lilane. She is improving in some things, Janya said with a pointed frown for the blue sister. Janya might have been as sure as any other sitter that the hall was getting a puppet when they raised Egwene, but she seemed to have accepted that Egwene did wear the stole, and deserved the proper respect from everyone. Of course, I doubt she'll catch Lyanna unless she applies herself, much less yourself, Mother. Young Bodawin might catch her, in fact. I wouldn't want to be outdone by a novice myself, but I suppose some don't feel that way. A stain of red crept into Chiron's cheeks, and her eyes dropped to the goblet. Tiana sniffed. Odowin's a good girl, but she spends more time giggling and playing with the other novices than applying herself she inhaled sharply. If she isn't watched. Yesterday, she and Alfin Conley tried 2 items at once, just to see what would happen, and the things fused together in a solid lump. Useless for sale, of course, unless you find someone who wants a pair of half-iron, half-Quendiar cups joined at angles. And the light knows what might have happened to the girls. They didn't seem to be harmed, but who can say about the next time? Make sure there isn't a next time, Egwene said absently, her attention on Chiron's cup. The line of white crept upward steadily. When Lyanna did this weave, black iron turned to white Quendiar as if the iron were sinking quickly into milk. For Egwene herself, the change was faster than the blink of an eye, black to white in a flash. It would have to be Chiron and Lyanna, but even Lyanna was barely fast enough. Chiron needed time to improve. Days? Weeks? Whatever was necessary, because anything less meant disaster, for the women involved and for the men who would die fighting in the streets of Tar Valon, and maybe for the tower. Suddenly Egwene was glad she had approved Bayanin's suggestion. Telling Chiron why she needed to try harder might have spurred her efforts, but this was another secret that had to be kept until the time came to unveil it to the world. Chapter 18. A Chat with Suan. Daishar had been taken away when Egwene left the tent, of course, but the 7-striped stole hanging from the opening of her cowl worked better than an Aes Sedai's face at making a way through the crowd. She moved in a ripple of curtsies, with the occasional bow thrown in from a porter or a craftsman who had some task among the sisters' tents. Some novices squeaked when they saw the Amerlin's stole, and whole families stepped hurriedly off the walkway, making their deep curtsies in the mire of the street. Since she had been forced to order punishment for some of the Two Rivers women, word had spread among the novices that the Amerlin was as hard as Sorela Bagand, and it was best to avoid incurring her temper, which could spring up like wildfire. Not that most of them knew enough history to have any real idea who Sorela had been, but her name had been a byword of iron-handed strictness in the tower for 100 years, and the accepted made sure that novices absorbed tidbits like that. It was a good thing that Egwene's cowl hid her face. By the 10th time a novice family leaped out of her way like frightened hares, she was gritting her teeth so hard that seeing her face would have cemented her reputation for chewing iron and spitting nails. She had the horrible feeling that in a few hundred years, Accepted would be using her name to frighten novices the way they used Sorela's now. Of course, there was the little matter of securing the White Tower first. Small irritations had to wait. She thought she could have spit nails without the iron. The crowds thinned to nothing around the Amerlin's study, which was just a peaked canvas tent with patched brown walls, despite the name. Like the hall, it was a place to be avoided unless you had business there or were summoned. No one was simply asked to the hall of the tower or the Amerlin's study. The most innocuous invitation to either was a summons, a fact that turned that simple tent into a haven. Sweeping through the entry flaps, she swung her cloak off with a feeling of relief. A pair of braziers made the tent deliciously warm after outside, and they gave off very little smoke. A touch of sweet scent lingered from the dried herbs that had been sprinkled on the glowing embers. The way those fool girls behave, you would think she began in a growl, and cut off abruptly. She was not surprised to see Suan standing beside the writing table in plain blue wool, finely cut but simple, a wide, tooled leather folder held to her chest. Most sisters still seemed to believe, like Delana, that she was reduced to instructing Egwene in protocol and running errands, grudgingly in both cases, but she was always there, bright and early, which seems to have gone unnoticed so far. Suan had been an Amerlin who chewed iron, though no one would believe who did not already know. Novices pointed her out as often as they did Lyanna, but with an air of doubt that she really was who the sisters said. Pretty, if not quite beautiful, with a delicate mouth and dark glossy hair to her shoulders, Suan looked even younger than Lyanna, only a few years older than Egwene. She could have been taken for one of the accepted without the blue-fringed shawl draped across her arms. That was why she never went without the shawl, to avoid embarrassing mistakes. Her eyes had not changed any more than her spirit, however, and they were icy blue awls aimed at the woman whose presence was a surprise. Halima was certainly welcome, yet Egwene had not expected to see her stretched out on the brightly colored cushions that were piled along one side of the tent, her head propped on one hand. Where Swan was pretty, the sort of young woman, seemingly young at least, who made men and women alike smile at her, Halima was stunning, with big green eyes and a perfect face, and a full, firm bosom, the sort who made men swallow and other women frown. Not that Egwene frowned, or believed the tales carried by women jealous of the way Halima attracted men just by being. She could not help the way she looked, after all. But even if her position as Delana's secretary was plainly a matter of charity by the Grey sister, a poorly educated countrywoman, Halima formed her letters with the awkwardness of a young child, Delana usually kept her busy all day with some sort of make-work. She seldom appeared before time for bed, and then it was nearly always because she had heard Egwene had one of her heads. Nisao could do nothing with those headaches, even using the new healing, but Halima's massages worked wonders, even when the pain had Egwene whimpering. "I told her you wouldn't have time for visits this morning, Mother," Swan said sharply, still glaring at the woman on the cushions as she took Egwene's cloak with her free hand. "But I might as well have played cat's cradle with myself as opened my mouth." Hanging the cloak on the rustic cloak stand, she snorted contemptuously. "Maybe if I wore breeches and had a mustache, she'd pay mind." Swan seemed to believe every one of the rumors about Halima's supposed depredations among the prettier craftsmen and soldiers. Strangely, Halima seemed amused by her reputation. She might even have enjoyed it. She laughed, low and throaty, and stretched on the cushions like a cat. She did have an unfortunate liking for low-cut bodices, incredible in this weather, and she nearly came out of her blue-slashed-green silk. Silk was hardly the usual garb for a secretary, but Delana's charity ran deep, for her debt to Halima did. "You seemed worried this morning, Mother," the green-eyed woman murmured. "And you slipped out so early for your ride, trying not to wake me. I thought you might like to talk. You wouldn't get so many headaches if you talked over your worries more. At least you know you can talk to me." Eyeing Swan, who was peering down her nose disdainfully, Halima gave another smoky laugh. "And you know I don't want anything from you, unlike some." Swan snorted again and deliberately busied herself with placing the folder on the writing table just so, between the stone inkwell and the sand jar. She even fiddled with the pen rest. With an effort, Egwene managed not to sigh. Just. Halima did ask for nothing beyond a pallet in Egwene's tent, so she could be on hand when one of Egwene's headaches came on, and sleeping there must have given difficulties with carrying out her duties for Delana. Besides, Egwene liked her earthy, outspoken manner. It was very easy to talk to Halima and forget for a little while that she was the Amerlin seat, a relaxation she didn't have even with Swan. She had fought too hard for recognition as Aes Sedai and Amelin, and her grip on that recognition was too tenuous. Every slip from being Amerlin would make the next slip easier, and the next after that, until she was back to being regarded as a child at play. That made Halima a luxury to be treasured, quite apart from what her fingers might do to Egwene's headaches. To her annoyance, though, every other woman in the camp appeared to share Swan's view, with the possible exception of Delana. Gray seemed too prudish to employ a light skirt, no matter what charity she thought she owed. In any case, whether the woman chased men or even tripped them up was beside the point now. "I'm afraid I do have work, Halima," she said, tugging off her gloves. A mountain of work, most days. There was no sign of Shiriam's reports on the table yet, of course, but she would be sending them soon, along with a few petitions she thought merited Egwene's attention. Just a few. 10 or 12 appeals for redress of grievances, with Egwene expected to pass the Amerlin's judgment on each. You could not do that without study and questions, not and hand down a just decision. Perhaps you can have dinner with me. If she finished in time to do more than eat at her table right there in her study. It was getting on toward midday already. We could talk then. Halima sat up abruptly, eyes flashing and full lips compressed, but her scowl vanished as quickly as it had come. A smoldering remained in her eyes, though. Had she been a cat, she would have had her back arched and her tail like a bottle brush. Rising gracefully to her feet on the layered carpets, she smoothed her dress over her hips. Very well, then, if you're certain you don't want me to stay. With remarkable timing, a dull throb began behind Egwene's eyes, an all too familiar precursor to a blinding headache. But she shook her head anyway and repeated that she had work to do. Halima hesitated a moment longer, her mouth going tight once more, hands fisting in her skirts. Then she snatched her fur-lined silk cloak from the cloak stand and stalked out of the tent without bothering to pull the garment around her shoulders. She could do herself an injury going about like that in the cold. That fishwife temper will get her in trouble sooner or later, Swan muttered before the entry flaps stopped swaying. Scowling after Halima, she twitched her shawl up onto her shoulders. The woman holds it in around you, but she doesn't mind giving me the rough side of it, me or anybody else. She's been heard screaming at Delana. Who ever heard of a secretary screaming at her employer? And a sister at that? A sitter? I don't understand why Delana puts up with her. That's Delana's business, surely. Questioning another sister's actions was just as forbidden as interfering with them. Only by custom, not law. Yet some customs were as strong as law. Surely she did not have to remind Swan of that. Rubbing her temples, Egwene sat down carefully in the chair behind her writing table, but the chair wobbled anyway. Designed to fold for storage on a wagon, the legs had a habit of folding when they were not supposed to, and none of the carpenters had been able to fix them after repeated attempts. The table folded as well, but that held up more firmly. She wished she had taken the opportunity to acquire a new chair in Murundi, yet there had been so many things that needed buying, and not enough coin to stretch when she already had a chair. At least she had acquired a pair of stand lamps and a table lamp, all three plain red-painted iron, but with good mirrors that were free of bubbles. Good light did not seem to help her headaches, yet it was better than trying to read by a few tallow candles and a lantern. If Swan heard any rebuke, it did not slow her down. It's more than just a temper. Once or twice I thought she was on the brink of trying to. I suppose she has sense enough to hold on. Not everyone is Aes Sedai. And she managed to break a wheelwright's arm. He says he fell. He's lying to me, with his eyes shifting and his mouth twitching. He wouldn't like admitting a woman bent his elbow backwards, now would he? Give over, Swan, Egwene said wearily. The man likely tried to take liberties. He must have. She could not see how Halima could have broken a man's arm in any event. However you described the woman, muscular did not come into it. Instead of opening the embossed folder that Swan had laid on the table, she rested her hands on either side of it. That kept them away from her head. Maybe if she ignored the pain, it would go away this time. Besides, for a change, she had information to share with Swan. It seems that some of the sitters are about negotiating with Elida, she began. Expressionless, Swan balanced herself atop one of the two rickety three-legged stools in front of the table and listened attentively, only her fingers moving, lightly stroking against her skirts, until Egwene finished. Then she made fists and growled a set of curses that were pungent even for her, beginning with a wish for a body to be choked to death on wheat and fish guts, and sliding downhill fast from there. Coming from that young, pretty face only made them worse. I suppose you're right letting it go forward, she muttered, once her invective ran down. The talk will spread now it's begun, and this way you gain a jump on it. Bayanin shouldn't surprise me, I suppose. Bayanin's ambitious, but I always thought she'd have gone scurrying back to Elida if Shiriam and the others hadn't stiffened her backbone. Voice quickening, Suan fixed her screen as if to lend weight to her words. I wish Verilyn and that lot surprised me, Mother. Discounting the blue, 6 sitters from 5 Ajas fled the tower after Elida carried out her coup. Her mouth twisted slightly on the word. And here we have 1 from each of those 5. I was in Tel Aran Riod last night in the tower. I hope you were careful, Egwene said sharply. Swan hardly seemed to know the meaning of careful sometimes. The few dream Terangrial in their possession had lines of sisters panting to use them, mostly to visit the tower. And while Swan had suddenly forbidden one, it was the next thing to. She could have put her name down forever without the hall granting her a single minute. Quite aside from blaming Swan for the tower being broken in the first place, she was not accepted back quite as warmly as Lyanna on that account, nor coffined by anyone. Quite aside from that, too many remembered her rough teaching when she was one of the few who knew how to use the dream Terangrial. Swan did not suffer fools gladly, and everyone was a fool their first few times in Tel Aran Riod. So now she had to borrow Lyanna's turn when she wanted to visit the world of dreams. And if another sister saw her there, the next thing to might become an outright ban. Or worse, set off a search for who had loaned her a Terangrial, which might end by unmasking Lyanna. In Tel Aran Riod, Swan said with a dismissive gesture, I'm a different woman in a different dress every time I turn a corner. That was good to hear, though it seemed likely a lack of control had as much to do with it as intent. Swan's belief in her own abilities was sometimes greater than warranted. The point is, last night I saw a partial list of sitters and managed to read most of the names before it changed to a tally of wines. That was a common occurrence in Tel Aran Riod, where nothing stayed the same for long unless it was a reflection of something permanent in the waking world. Andaya Foray was raised for the gray, Rena Hafton for the green, and Juelaine Madoma for the brown. None has worn the shawl more than 70 years at most. Elida has the same problem we do, Mother. I see, Egwene said slowly. She realized that she was massaging the side of her head. The throb behind her eyes beat on. It would grow stronger. It always did. By nightfall, she was going to regret having sent Halima away. Bringing her hand down firmly, she moved the leather folder in front of her a half-inch to the left, then slid it back. What of the rest? They had 6 sitters to replace. Farana Neheran was raised for the white, Suan admitted, and Suana Dragand for the yellow. They've both been in the hall before. It was only a partial list, and I didn't get to read it all. Her back straightened and her chin shot out stubbornly. 1 or 2 raised before time would be unusual enough. It happens, but not often. But this makes 11, maybe 12, but 11 for sure, between us and the tower. I don't believe in coincidences that big. When the fishmongers are all buying at the same price, you can bet they were all drinking at the same inn last night. You don't have to convince me anymore, Suan. With a sigh, Egwene sat back, automatically catching the chair leg that always tried to fold when she did. Clearly something odd was happening. But what did it mean? And who could influence the choice of sitters in every Aja? Every Aja except the blue, at least. They had chosen 1 new sitter, but Moria had been Aes Sedai well over 100 years. And maybe the red was not affected. No one knew what changes, if any, had been made in the red sitters. The black might be behind it, but what could they gain, unless all of those 2 young sitters were black? That seemed impossible in any case. If the Black Aja had had that much influence, the hall would have been all dark friends long ago. Yet if there was a pattern and coincidence would not hold, then someone had to be at the heart of it. Just thinking about the possibilities, the impossibilities, made the dull pain behind her eyes grow a little sharper. If this turns out to be happenstance after all, Swan, you're going to regret ever thinking you saw a puzzle. She forced a smile saying that, to take out any sting. and Amerlin had to be careful with her words. Now that you've convinced me there is a puzzle, I want you to solve it. Who is responsible and what are they after? Until we know that, we don't know anything. Is that all you want? Swan said dryly. Before supper or after? After will have to do, I suppose, Egwene snapped, then took a deep breath at the abashed look on the other woman's face. There was no point taking her headache out on Swan. And Amerlin's words had power, and sometimes consequences. She had to remember that. As soon as you can would be very good, though, she said in a milder voice. I know you'll be as quick as you can. Chagrined or not, Swan seemed to understand that Egwene's outburst came from more than her own sarcasm. Despite her youthful appearance, she had years of practice at reading faces. Shall I go find Halima? She said, half rising. The lack of tartness attached to the woman's name was a measure of her concern. It won't take a minute. If I give way for every ache, I'll never get anything done, Egwene said, opening the folder. Now what do you have for me today? She kept her hands on the papers, though, to stop from rubbing her head. One of Swan's tasks each morning was to fetch what the Ajahs were willing to share from their networks of eyes and ears, along with whatever individual sisters had passed on to their Ajahs, and the Ajahs had decided to pass on to Egwene. It was a strange process of sieving, yet it still gave a fair picture of the world when added to what Swan put in. She had managed to hold on to the agents that had been hers as Amerlin by the simple expedient of refusing to tell anyone who they were, despite every effort by the Hall. And in the end, no one could gainsay that those eyes and ears were the Amerlins, and that they should by rights report to Egwene. Oh, there had been no end of grumbling over it, and still was on occasion, but no one could deny the facts. As the first report came from neither the Ajahs nor Swan, but Lyanna, written on thin sheets of paper in a flowing, elegant hand. Egwene could not see exactly why, but you could never doubt that anything Lyanna wrote had been written by a woman. Those pages Egwene held to the table lamp's flame one by one as soon as she read them, letting the paper burn almost to her fingers, then crumpling the ash. It would hardly do for her and Lyanna to behave like near strangers in public, then allow one of her reports to fall into the wrong hands. Very few sisters were aware that Lyanna had eyes and ears inside Tar Valon itself. She might have been the only sister who did. It was a human failing to watch keenly what was happening down the street while ignoring what lay right at your feet. And the light knew Aes Sedai had as many human failings as anyone else. Unfortunately, Lyanna had little new to communicate. Her people in the city complained of filthy streets that were increasingly dangerous after dark and little safer by daylight. Once, crime had been all but unknown in Tar Valon, but now the tower guards had abandoned the streets to patrol the harbors and the bridge towers. Except for collecting the customs duties and buying supplies, both done through intermediaries, the White Tower seemed to have shut itself off from the city completely. The great doors that allowed the public to enter the tower remained shut and barred, and no one had seen a sister outside the tower to know her as Aes Sedai since the siege began, if not earlier. All confirmation of what Lyanna had reported before. The last page made Egwene's eyebrows rise, though. Rumor in the streets said Gareth Bryn had found a secret way into the city, and would appear inside the walls with his whole army any day. Lyanna would have said if anyone had breathed a word that sounded like they meant gateways, Swan said quickly when she saw Egwene's expression. She had read all of these reports already, of course, and knew what Egwene was seeing by which page she held. Shifting on the unsteady stool, Swan almost fell off onto the carpet she was paying so little heed. It did not slow her down a hair, though. And you can be sure Gareth hasn't let anything slip, she went on, while still righting herself. Not that any of his soldiers are fool enough to desert to the city now, but he knows when to keep his mouth shut. He just has the reputation for attacking where he can't possibly be. He's done the impossible often enough that people expect him to, that's all. Hiding a smile, Egwene held the paper mentioning Lord Gareth to the flame and watched it curl and blacken. A few months past, Swan would have offered an acid comment about the man instead of praise. He would have been Gareth Bloody Bryn, not Gareth. She could not possibly miss doing his laundry and polishing his boots. But Egwene had seen her staring at him on those rare times when he came to the Aes Sedai camp. Staring and then running away if he so much as glanced at her. Swan! Running away! Swan had been Aes Sedai for more than 20 years and Amerlin for 10, but she had no more idea how to deal with being in love than a duck had about shearing sheep. Egwene crumbled the ash and dusted her hands together, her smile fading. She had no room to talk about Swan. She was in love too, but she did not even know where in the world Gawain was, or what to do if she learned. He had his duty to Andor, and she hers to the Tower, and the one way to bridge that chasm, bonding him, might lead to his death. Better to let him go, forget him entirely. As easy as forgetting her own name. And she would bond him. She knew that. Of course, she could not bond the man without knowing where he was, without having her hands on him, so it all came full circle. Men were a bother. Pausing to press her fingers against her temples, it did nothing to lessen the pulsing pain. She put Gawain out of her mind, as far out as she could. She thought she had a foretaste of what it was like being a warder. There was something of Gawain in the back of her head, and liable to kick its way into her consciousness at the most inconvenient time. Concentrating on the business at hand, she picked up the next sheet. Much of the world had vanished as far as eyes and ears were concerned. Little news came from the lands held by the Seanchan, and that divided between fanciful descriptions of Seanchan beasts delivered as proof they were using shadow spawn, horrifying tales of women being tested to see whether they should be collared as Damani, and depressing stories of acceptance. The Seanchan, it seemed, were no worse rulers than any others, and better than some, as long as you were not a woman who could channel, and all too many people appeared to have given up thoughts of resistance once it became clear the Seanchan would let them go on with their lives. Arad Doman was almost as bad, producing nothing but rumors, admitted as such by the sisters who wrote the reports, but included just to show the state the country was in. King Al-Salam was dead. No, he had begun channeling and gone mad. Rodel Ituralda, the great captain, also was dead, or he had usurped the throne, or was invading Saldaea. The Council of Merchants were all dead as well, or had fled the country, or begun a civil war over who the next king was to be. Any of those might have been true, or none. The Ajahs were accustomed to seeing everything, but now a third of the world had been enveloped in dense fog, with only the tiniest gaps. At least, if there were any clearer views, no Ajah had deigned to pass on what they saw there. Another problem was that the Ajahs saw different things as having paramount importance, and largely ignored anything else. The Greens, for example, were particularly concerned over tales of borderland armies near New Brain, hundreds of leagues from the blight they were supposed to be guarding. Their report talked of the borderlanders, and only the borderlanders, as if something had to be done and done now. Not that they suggested anything, or so much as hinted, yet frustrations came through in the cramped, hasty handwriting that spidered urgently across the page. Egwene had the truth of that situation from Elaine, but she was content to let the Greens gnash their teeth for the moment, since Swan had revealed why they were not rushing off to set matters straight. According to her agent in New Brain, the Borderlanders were accompanied by 50 or 100 sisters, perhaps 200. The number of Aes Sedai might be uncertain, and it must be wildly inflated, of course, but their presence was a fact the Greens had to be aware of, though the reports they sent to Egwene never mentioned them. No Ajah had mentioned those sisters in their reports. In the end, though, there was little difference between 200 sisters and 2. No one could be certain who those sisters were, or why they were there. Yet poking a nose in would surely be seen as interfering. It seemed strange that they could be engaged in a war between Aes Sedai and still be held back from interfering with another sister by custom, but thankfully it was so. At least they don't suggest sending anyone to Camelin. Egwene blinked, the pain behind her eyes sharpened by following the tight letters. Swan gave a derisive snort. Why should they? As far as they know, Elaine is letting Marililla and Vandene guide her, so they're sure they'll get their Aes Sedai queen, and a green at that. Besides, as long as the Ashamans stay out of Camelin, no one wants to take the chance of stirring them up. The way things stand, we might as well try pulling wasp jellies out of the water with our bare hands, and even the Greens know it. Anyway, that won't stop some sister, green or otherwise, from dropping into Camelin. Just a quiet visit to see one of her eyes and ears, or to have a dress made, or buy a saddle, or the light knows why else. Even the Greens? Egwene said tartly. Everyone thought of Browns being this way and Whites that, even when it was demonstrably not so. And sometimes she bristled a little at hearing Greens lumped together as if they were all the same woman. Maybe she did think of herself as a Green, or as having been one, which was silly. The Amerlin was of all Ajahs and none. She adjusted the stole on her shoulders, reminding herself of the fact represented by those 7 stripes, and she had never belonged to one in the first place. Yet she did feel not fondness, that was too strong, a sense of sameness between herself and Green sisters. How many sisters are unaccounted for, Suan? Even the weakest can travel wherever they want, linked, and I wish I knew where they went. For a moment, Suan frowned in thought. About 20, I think, she said finally. Maybe a few less. The number changes day to day. No one keeps track, really. No sister would stand still for it. She leaned forward, carefully balancing herself this time when the uneven legs made her stool lurch. You've juggled matters beautifully so far, Mother, but it can't last. Eventually, the Hall will find out everything that's going on in Camelin. They might accept keeping the Seanchan